Governor Deal says the state needs help in protecting neglected and abused children. He asks that grandparents step up. We'll look at the buzz his words have generated. A new bill would make Sunday voting mandatory statewide, but it would shorten the time for early voting. Who does the proposed legislation benefit and who does it hurt? Lawmakers starts right now. Good evening and welcome to Lawmakers. I'm Bill Nigut. Governor Deal, who is himself a grandfather, wants to see grandparents take a bigger role in protecting their grandchildren when they're at risk. We'll get to that a little later. And a powerful Christian lobbying group sets out its agenda. How much power does the Faith and Freedom Coalition actually wield with Georgia lawmakers? Before we get into that and all of our other stories, let's check out what happened under the Gold Dome today with GPB's Pat St. Clair. Pat?
Hi, Bill. I'm sure you've heard the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, today the Senate passed a bill 43-10, sponsored by Senator Renee Unterman. The aim of that bill is to make it easier for families to reach out to that village in times of need.
It's my privilege to be able to have worked on a bill, Senate Bill 3, for the past year.
Unterman says her bill would help families simplify the process of getting a friend or family member to help care for children when necessary.
The whole supposition of the bill is that you don't have to go to court. You don't have to load up the kids in the station wagon and take them to the courthouse, and the trauma of going to the courthouse and being presented before a judge and saying why mom and daddy or mama can't take care of them, and now somebody else is going to take care of them.
Can DFACS, at any point, if there's an open case, can it stop the power of attorney, or ultimately are they just giving an advisory input onto the situation?
No, sir, I believe you're correct. I believe DFACS does have that authority, and they would intervene. And they actually have been to my office twice to make sure that they have that power and that power is not taken away from them, and they have no intention to try and change that current intervention type of system.
After the vote, we talked with the senator about the bill and what happens next.
Senate Bill 3 is known as the Strengthening and Supporting Families Act, and what it does is give a non-blood person that you may know the ability to have a power of attorney so they can temporarily take care of your children, and the children can stay in their same school system and also have a medical home.
Why are you feeling this is so necessary?
I think it's an alternative. Several years ago, I wrote a bill, 2008, Grandparents Raising Grandchildren, and that was during the recession when a lot of grandparents were taking in their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and this is just an extension of it. The main objective of it is to be able to defer kids out of the foster care system. That these are kids that are not in trouble, it's just that their family's in stress. It may be a single mom with 2 kids and she might have to go to an addiction program, or it could even be someone who's in the service and they get deployed overseas and their kids could temporarily stay with someone else and they would take care of them.
How exactly does it work? How long would the power of attorney last?
It can be up to 12 months and then it can be renewed after 12 months. And at any given time, the custodial parent can renege on the contract and say, I want my kids back, and they automatically go back at any given time.
And so what is the status now? What happened today?
It passed in the Senate. It's going to go over to the House, and it had a lot of support. There will be probably some more amendments about sexual offender registry and making sure that people that take care of these kids don't have a prior history, and I'm amenable to that amendment.
Of course, we will follow that bill as it makes its way through the House. Also today, there was testimony at an Education Committee hearing on Senate Bill 44. It would grant in-state tuition to so-called dreamers, children brought to the U.S. illegally by their parents, so that they could attend Georgia public colleges and universities. The bill is sponsored by State Senator Nan Orrock.
20 states across the country allow these students to attend with in-state tuition. And let me tell you that it's very interesting. In these states that have a track record, they can look now and see that their dropout rates are improving among immigrant students, because when they see that there's a pathway to college, there's a reason to stay in school and stay enrolled.
Dulce Guerrero is 22 years old. In fact, today is her birthday, and her wish is for Georgia lawmakers to approve Senate Bill 44.
I came to this country when I was 2 years old. I graduated from Pebblebrook High School in 2011. I was able to enroll in community college for 1 semester, paying out-of-state tuition. Because of the high cost of out-of-state tuition, I was forced to drop out December of 2011, and I haven't been back to college since then.
The bill is not without detractors. Republican consultant Phil Kent says it's simply not fair to legal residents.
When you're allowing deferred action students to get into our university system and technical college, remember that their action is deferred. These are still illegal students.
Senator Orrock says there will be other hearings on the bill in the near future. And finally, we're getting ready for tomorrow's debate on the governor's education plan. The House and Senate Education Committees will be meeting in joint session in order to review his plan for the state to take over failing schools. The big questions include how many schools, for how long, and how will it all be paid for. It's going to be a very busy day here at the Capitol tomorrow. Back to you, Bill.
Thanks, Pat. Well, there are a lot of things starting to really percolate at the Capitol at this point. Inspiring discussions of state versus federal rights and whether certain problems are the responsibility of the government or of its citizens. Joining me tonight, Jackie Gingrich Cushman, syndicated conservative columnist and author. Howard Franklin, one of the youngest and most successful Democratic strategists in Georgia. And Eric Tanenblatt, who is one of Georgia's most highly respected advisors to GOP candidates in Georgia and at the national level. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here tonight. As we sit here on Tuesday night, we know that tomorrow the governor is going to go in and talk to a group of legislators about exactly what his plans are for taking over so-called failing schools. In his State of the State speech, he pointed out that 23% of the schools in Georgia are getting either a D or an F rating. And he said it's time the state step in. He wanted to create opportunity, initially said opportunity school districts. Now he's talking about individual schools. We're waiting for the details on this, Howard Franklin. What does the governor need to do to convince Democrats and Republicans that this is a good move?
Well, at a certain level, you have to applaud the governor for taking on an issue that dogged him during the campaign trail. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of questions that are still very much unanswered. I think this 23% is a very big number. And if you're going to bring along Democrats, I think you've got to show an even-handed process. It doesn't look like, straight school takeovers, but still can show some results in enough school districts where we can see some improvement.
Yeah, Jackie and Eric, during the end of last week, or toward the end of last week, rather, Democrats down there were assembling a list of some 140, 150 schools that they said really could fall under the classification of so-called failing schools, and they were trying to make a point about overreach. But we really don't think the governor is going to take that big a gulp, do we?
Well, I don't think he is. I mean, the devil is obviously in the details, as Eric said. We're talking earlier, and he mentioned that. But I think what's happening is, Howard's right, it was a big issue in the campaign. It's a big issue to Governor Deal. His wife's a teacher. We know he's been a big champion of early education to make sure children are ready to go to kindergarten and ready to learn to read. So education is very important to him. And when he sits there and sees all of these schools failing, and we look at 19,000 dropouts from high school in a year, he knows something has to be done. So we'll see what he rolls out, but my guess is hopefully they'll start relatively small, make sure they actually show improvements in those schools. And there's going to be some back and forth among the different groups about, is it funding or is it not funding? But for those of us that have been through school and have kids, we know that it's not the money, it's actually the experience in the classroom with the teachers. Now, you have to make sure the teachers have the resources and the teachers are respected and paid. But in the end, it's all about that moment in time when the teachers are with the children.
Yeah, Eric, as I think you know, I talked to Brian Robinson, the governor's communications director, at the end of last week, and he made the point that the critics who are accusing him of potential overreach are just barking up the wrong tree. They're going to do this in a very limited fashion because they want to succeed to be able to show people this is a smart idea.
Absolutely. And if you look at the governor's record since he's been governor, his first term, what he did with charter schools. Jackie mentioned his early education commitment. This idea came up. You heard him talk about it during the campaign when Governor Jindal from Louisiana was here, and looking at what's been done in New Orleans. So I think the governor and his team are really going to be very smart when they roll this out. I don't think we should be quick to passing judgment until we know all of the details. As I said earlier, you know, the devil's going to be in the details. But I think he's very committed to making sure that this is a success.
I will say one thing. I mean, a lot of this has been compared to the reforms in Louisiana, and what we've seen, at least from the preliminary results out of there, is that doubling administrative costs there. So I do want to caution
the
us.
opportunity school districts
Absolutely.
in New Orleans are expensive, is what you're
Very
saying.
expensive, and we don't want to get on the slippery slope of a place where this might be an unfunded mandate. I do think starting small makes a lot of sense, but I think the other question is where does the actual Department of Education for the state come in here, since these folks will report directly to the governor's office?
Well, and the other big question that they're going to have to resolve, and I'm not sure that it'll be interesting to see if they're ready to define it when they meet tomorrow. What is a failing school? Now, again, Brian Robinson said we don't have any intention of saying those 23% of D and F schools are all going to be coming under state control. But that's going to be tricky, figuring out what it means to be a failing school.
Oh, absolutely. I think Howard mentioned earlier, they have to make sure that it's laid out and easily understood, and that you can compare it from one school to the other. So you're not wondering why did they get picked and not a different school. So a lot of us could be into the details, and I'm sure it's going to be a combination of their ratings as well as dropouts, as well as test scores for the children. So I'm sure it'll be a multiple of different items, and we'll have to wait and see what actually gets rolled out.
Howard, you're spending a lot of time down at the Capitol these days. You're doing some lobbying. Do you see Democrats being potentially willing to get behind this? We've got this list that they developed of all these schools.
Sure.
Are they preparing to do battle, or do you think they could become partners in this?
I think we're still very much in a wait-and-see mode, but I do think Democrats are going to be wary of education reforms from this administration. I think some of the shifting of control from the local level up to a centralized state, will certainly raise some eyebrows. But I do think it's a mixed bag on education. I think we've had a long time at the bottom of a lot of lists on education, and so if someone could prove that something works here, I think people will be open to hear.
But I do think that whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, I think everyone is committed to good quality education for kids.
And that's the question that I was going to raise. And I'm not suggesting that any of you, and certainly not I, have answers to this, but this state, the citizens of this state, have dealt with problems with our public schools for decades. I got here in 1983. Governor Joe Frank Harris was trying to figure out quality basic education, a way to improve the states. We have gone through one education reform plan after another under various governors, and the question is, are they really going to get anywhere with these things?
Well, I mean, clearly we hope they will. But back to the point I made earlier, I think it's very hard because it's a combination of students, parents, community, teachers, administration. It's a very complex system, and the systems that work well are the systems. I mean, I grew up in a small town, Carrollton, where I went to public school, a lot of parent involvement, teachers very dedicated, long tenure, a big focus on education. And there was nothing to do on the weekends besides, go to football games and go to church.
And look how well you turned. Look how well you turned out.
I think, I think the good news is we still care enough to go try and do something else and not say, gosh, we're failing and no one cares. But it's a challenging subject.
And we don't have a choice. I mean, we're talking about preparing the workforce for the future. And we need to make sure we have good quality education for all of our kids so that the state can continue to grow and flourish.
Okay. Any irony at all, Howard, that Republicans who are so much in favor of local control are now coming up with a state solution that would reach into local schools?
Certainly a little bit of irony there, but again, as Eric said, you got to applaud someone who takes an executive action, says we got to fix something that hasn't been fixed over decades. So we will see. I think the proof is in the pudding. We'll see in a year or two what this looks like.
All right, terrific. Let's move on, but let's stick with Governor Deal, if we can. Toward the end of last week, he appeared at a meeting of the annual luncheon of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, which is Ralph Reed's organization, conservative Christians who have political agendas they deal with every year. And the governor got up and he made some remarks that he acknowledged in making them were going to surprise and perhaps shock some people. In fact, let's go to what he talked about. He did not talk about the issues that were foremost on their minds, which we're going to discuss ourselves on this show in a little while. He didn't talk about those issues. Instead, he picked something brand new, and it had to do with DFACS, the criticism that DFACS has taken for failing children who are abused, neglected, die in some cases. And the governor had some interesting remarks to make about this. Let's put it up on the screen and see what he said about some of these things, if we can.
When is the last time the press or anybody else asked the greater family, why didn't you do something about this? It really galls me, quite frankly. To see an able-bodied grandparent complaining about the fact that DFACS didn't do something to protect her grandchildren. And my question is, well, where were you?
All right, that wasn't me. That actually was the governor making those remarks. Jackie, he got a lot of applause for those remarks. Is he onto something here? Or can he really say that DFACS needs to rely on families to handle these problems?
Well, I don't think he's saying they need to rely on families, but I do think he has a point. And I think you made a very good point in the introduction. One is that he was talking about his agenda, what he was doing to that particular audience, which is a very conservative audience. He wasn't talking about what they wanted to talk about. He was talking about something that he's concerned about. He's very concerned about children. They've been very involved with working with children. He's said they're going to put more money into DFACS to make sure there are more people to handle the caseload. But he also recognizes that while government is the last resort and should be the safety net, that in reality, the people that see the children day to day are their families. So I think he's saying, that if you see something, you've got to have more involvement. And part of that is back to the school education as well, as it takes not just, a single person. Government can't do everything, but the families, the parents, the fathers, the grandparents need to step up and contribute as well.
But this is, DFACS, this is not just under Governor Deal. This is a problem that happens all the time, and you can't just expect DFACS to handle all of these problems. And it does require that the families also play a more active role.
Well, some of the pushback, though, that he got was from folks who said, hey, there are a lot of families where grandparents already really are very much in the mix.
I would take it a step further. I would go so far as to say there are hundreds, if not thousands of organizations that are family-based, that are churches, that are picking up a lot of the slack. And without them, DFACS and other government agencies would be even more stretched to deliver important services. But I think he's sort of missing the point here, which is DFACS is a safety net that's there when families are failing children. So, to say that the government shouldn't be doing this work is to acknowledge.
Well, he didn't say they shouldn't be doing work. We should be clear about that.
And I think the question is, how much of that work should they be doing? So, clearly the government is supposed to be the safety net and the last resort. And when tragedies happen, they are tragic, and you hate to see children hurt. Right. But the question is, are there other people that can get involved?
All right, let's do this. We're running late, but let's do something as quickly as we can. Let's listen to something else the governor said that he also acknowledged was going to be controversial to that same group.
Now, I'm going to step on even more toes with this one. Why is it that we always arrest the mother and nobody ever asks the question, where's the father of this child?
I have to be honest, Howard, I don't quite understand where he's going with that.
That makes two of us.
The question, we're talking, I assume, about single-parent families. But I'm not quite sure where you go with this. What is he saying? Can anybody decode this for me or make sense of it?
We have a lot of kids that are born out of wedlock to single moms, and what are we doing about all of these dads? And I think he was raising that issue that these mothers are the ones that are getting blamed, but the fathers are getting away with it, and I think that's a very valid point to make.
I think it's a valid point too, but I do think we got to be careful, and this governor so far has been careful about making social policy through the actions of a government agency. And I think that, at a certain point, again, we're at a slippery slope where we say, let's figure out how to address some of these inequities that are, inborn in these relationships.
And I will also say, too, there are a lot of faith programs, faith-based programs around the state that really help in this area and do great work.
To close this out, because we have to get to a break, although he didn't propose anything specific in these remarks, he did go on in his comments to suggest that he very well might have some sort of package that he will bring to legislators that relates in some way to these issues. At least that was the way some people read between the lines in remarks he made after those controversial comments. So it's going to be very interesting to see if he does do that and where he goes with this conversation. So hold on. We've got a lot more to talk about, and we're going to come right back with Sunday voting. Who stands to benefit from a new bill that'll make it uniform across the state? Also ahead, tonight on Lawmakers, they're opposed to medical marijuana and a proposed anti-bullying bill. We'll discuss the Faith and Freedom Coalition and its clout at the Capitol. Back with that and more in a moment, but first, how well do you know your lawmakers? David Wilkerson is a Democrat from Estelle. He represents House District 38. He was sworn in to the Georgia General Assembly in 2011. Wilkerson was born in Fort Dix, New Jersey, the son of a first-class sergeant. He tells us that during high school and college, he worked at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey, where he held down a variety of positions, including managing the recording studio and having to guess people's age or weight. That last skill might not be popular in his current profession. We're back with more Lawmakers in just a moment.
What will these little things be capable of next? And why does it matter? In this age of devices and apps, with the world at our fingertips and the future arriving sooner, how can you stay informed? SciTech Now is a new show covering a full range of science, tech, and geek culture stories, from startups to Star Wars, with national news and what's happening right around here. So join us. It's going to be a wild ride. SciTech Now, Wednesdays at 7:30.
I love coming to a place to work where I can be myself fully. I get to do a lot of different things. I get to talk about what's great in the world. Pledge is a fundraiser's dream. A lot of the staff and people who pitch here at GPB, they really want to be here. You know, they participate in the fundraising because they feel like it's a way for them to give back. I have a lot of reasons to love being here. I'm Aisha Rashid Hyman. I'm the Direct Marketing Manager and On-Air Fundraising Producer at GPB.
Civil rights activist and politician Grace Towns Hamilton was born in Atlanta on this date in 1907. Among her many notable accomplishments, Hamilton was the first African-American woman elected to the Georgia General Assembly. She was elected in 1964. Hamilton continued serving in the Georgia House through 1984 and died in 1992. Today, a chair in the Emory University Political Science Department is named in her honor. Grace Hamilton, for those of us who are lucky enough to know her, was a luminous person down at the state capitol, a remarkable woman. Welcome back to Lawmakers. I'm Bill Nigut. My guest tonight, Jackie Gingrich Cushman, syndicated conservative columnist, Democratic strategist Howard Franklin, and GOP advisor Eric Tanenblatt. All right, Sunday voting. We now have a bill from Mark Hamilton. We had Sunday voting in some 20 counties last November, and now Mark Hamilton comes along and says we need to make it uniform. We should do this statewide. But the hook is, he says, let's reduce the period of early voting to, I think, 15 days, right. Howard Franklin.
Well, I think it's interesting we're having this conversation now where we're moving some money around for this transportation bill, and we could potentially be taking some money out of county budgets, again, to open up those facilities for Sunday voting. I think Democrats, though, by and large, are for more access to the ballot, for uniformity to that access. You know, Saturdays, Sundays, same-day registration, the whole nine if it's on the table.
Well, let me be careful here, because if you reduce the number of days of early voting and have Sunday voting instead, you might offset some of the costs of that longer early voting
Maybe
period,
so.
right?
And I would also say, you know, if you look at most of the counties, you know, looking back at 2014, 2012, the vast majority of folks who take advantage of early voting take advantage in that last week.
All right, well, the real question here is, you know, Democrats thought, this was inspired mostly by Democratic county commissioners back in the election last year, who thought that Sunday voting, they could turn out black churches to mobilize their congregants to go to the polls on Sunday. Didn't seem to work all that well, but is this an effort by Republicans to make sure it doesn't work well down the road?
No, I think this is an effort by Republicans to say if we're going to do something, let's do it across the whole state, which I think makes perfect sense. Whatever we decide to do, I think we should do for everywhere. I agree with Howard. I think if it's in a small county, you don't want to have it open too long because it costs a lot of money to have that poll open. But you want to make sure that if you do Sunday voting, that you have a long enough time. And I think we used to be at 45 days originally. Which is a really long time, and from a political perspective, I think shortening up to a little shorter time period makes more sense since lots happen.
I will say this last election cycle, we saw, I believe, early voting go mainstream, and so I think 2008 we saw 53% fully of the electorate show up early to cast a ballot. Certainly in presidential years, that's gonna it's gonna.
Did you vote early?
I did.
Do you? Either of you?
This was the first year I voted early.
Okay. Did you like that experience?
I actually did.
Yeah?
Voted early, yeah.
Okay, I did too, but I missed that polling place at 7 a.m. on election day. Right. So in any case, let's move on to our last topic today. I mentioned early in the show, of course, that Governor Deal spoke at the Faith and Freedom Coalition luncheon last week. They unveiled their legislative agenda that day, too. And there are a couple things on it that caught our eye. One of them is they are opposed to the medical marijuana bill that Alan Peake has been pushing and keeps finding some obstacles in. Jackie, they say that they worry that this is opening the door. Who knows what treatment will be sought, a legality to treat what disease down the road. Does that make sense to you? Or is it they just don't like marijuana?
I think maybe you may be right. And I think clearly Alan's done a lot of work. He's held a lot of hearings around the state to figure out what's happening and what's involved, a lot of research. I think he's done a lot of good work. Hopefully something will get passed at some point during the session. They're obviously concerned, or whatever they're concerned about. So we'll see how it plays out.
I mean, you're right. I think a lot of work has been done, but I think you got to remember why this is happening. I mean, we're talking about medicinal marijuana, an oil format. I do think there's going to be some push and pull on the number of designations or the number of ailments that get addressed by this, but I think ultimately this looks like something that is going to happen. Needs to happen.
Yeah, I think they're looking to get this more focused, and that Representative Peake's bill may go a little bit.
Yeah, we've talked about it on the show.
Right.
He expanded the list of conditions that would be make it legal to treat with cannabis oil.
Right, but that happened as a result of going around the state and listening to people and hearing what was out there. So I mean, it'll be interesting. There will be some push and pull, like all negotiations, to see what ends up.
So let's look at one last issue that they raised, which is, and it's interesting they did because no one else has talked about it at this point. Keisha Waits, Democrat in the House, has a bill to prevent bullying in schools. It is a huge problem in Georgia, as it is everywhere. And part of that bill would protect gay and lesbian children from bullying as one of the so-called enumerated classes. Faith and Freedom Coalition says they oppose that. They say they oppose it because they don't want to see religious schools, private schools, faced with having to accept homosexuality as if it's an okay concept. Does that really resonate with you?
I'm looking for a little more leadership from this group. I think a really great roadmap on an issue like this one is where we saw prison reform, and we have folks, in the liberal or more progressive community. We had budget or fiscal hawks looking to, trim some of the numbers off of the budget, and we found really a compromise that made sense. I think there's still a compromise that's possible in a space like this one, but I think we need a little more leadership from that group.
There is history here, Eric Tanenblatt. We have, since the state Supreme Court struck down a bullying bill almost 15 years ago because it didn't have enumerated classes. Legislature won't take one on because they don't want to codify in some way gay rights in schools.
Well, I look, this is a bigger issue, not just this bill, and I think people need to start, understanding the changing demographics of the country, and you're seeing it with what's going on with marriage.
Just after the Supreme Court yesterday acted.
Exactly.
Right, right. And so this is something that, there are certain groups that feel very strongly in, different views on the issue.
Okay, look, we are completely out of time. Terrific job, all of you, for moving us through this discussion, and I appreciate it. Jackie Cushman, Eric Tanenblatt, Howard Franklin, thank you so much for being with us today. So that's it. Day 13 of the 2015 legislative session is a wrap. They are moving quickly at this point. In the meantime, come back to us tomorrow night, but you can stay in touch with us on social media. Email us at lawmakers@gpp.org. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Have a great evening.
This is a GPB original production.